Okay, so what's the deal with this Jesus guy? Like, who even is he? Okay, here's my best shot. Let's do it, alright? So you know how people say that they want to see a miracle? Well, guess what? It's not like miracles are all that common, you know? And let's be honest, the biggest ones usually involve like turning water into wine at some random wedding or healing a dude who is possessed by a demon and is like really sick. But there's this one story about Jesus that I think is probably my favorite, but also might be the most overlooked. So let me just tell you this story and then we can talk about it afterwards. Alright, so once Jesus was hanging out with a group of religious leaders and scholars, and they were having a little debate or an argument. You know, they were probably arguing about something that only religious scholars would argue about. And Jesus is like, hey, you guys want to hear a little story? And they're all like, yeah, sure. So he says, well, once upon a time a man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on the way he got robbed and beaten up and left half dead by the roadside. So a priest comes across him and sees him there, and he's like, oh man, that sucks. But I've got things to do and places to be, so peace out. Then a Levite comes across him and he's like, oh man, that really sucks. But I've got things to do and places to be, so peace out. But then a Samaritan, which is like the ultimate insult, right? Like the Jews hated the Samaritans more than any other group because they weren't really Jewish. They were kind of like the half-breeds. They were like the bastard children of the nation of Israel. So they were unanimously considered fully Jewish because their ancestors had intermixed with some other people when they came back to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile. So the Jews looked down on the Samaritans. So anyway, this Samaritan comes across this guy and he doesn't even look at him twice. He doesn't even acknowledge him at all. But then he does this very random thing, like he totally shifts his perspective and he decides to help this guy out. So he poured oil and wine on his wounds and set his arm and leg bones and put him on his donkey and took him to a nearby inn and paid for his room and everything. And then the next day he came back to check on him and took care of him and did all this stuff. And then after he paid for his room and gave the innkeeper money for taking care of him, he disappeared. And then Jesus asked these religious leaders, hey, who do you think was the good guy in this story? Like, who was a neighbor to this poor dying guy on the side of the road? And they were like, well, obviously the Samaritan, right? Like, he was a total jerk at first, but then he ended up helping this guy out. And Jesus was like, and then he said this. He said, go and do likewise. And that's the end of the story. But let's just take a minute to unpack this. Dude, this is crazy. This is crazy. First of all, you know, there's this idea that if you want to be saved, you have to be a good person. But I think this story shows us that being good isn't just about doing good things, like helping someone out, being nice to them, whatever. I think this story is trying to show us that being good is actually about changing your perspective. Like the priest and the Levite, they saw this guy and they immediately said, how can I get away from this situation as fast as possible? How can I avoid this guy? How can I stop looking at him? But the Samaritan, he didn't help him at first, right? Like he didn't even acknowledge this guy. But then he decided to step into the shoes of this guy on the side of the road. And instead of saying, how can I get away from this guy? How can I stop looking at this guy? He said, what would it look like if I came over here and helped this guy out? What would it look like if I cared about this guy? And that's when he became a good Samaritan. The problem with religion is that sometimes we miss the point. Sometimes we get so caught up in all the rules and all the regulations and all the things that we're supposed to do and not do that we forget about the main idea of it all. But I think this story is a great reminder for us that at the end of the day, God isn't really looking for us to be good all the time. Like he knows we're going to mess up. He knows that we're all going to screw up. But what he wants us to remember is that he loves us, and he wants us to love other people the way that he loves us. And I think that's the big idea here.